Over the weekend, President Trump deployed 2,000 California National Guard members to quell the unrest that developed over the weekend in Los Angeles after anti-ICE protests escalated into violent confrontations between police officers and demonstrators. The protest came after the Department of Homeland Security said it arrested over 100 people accused of being undocumented immigrants in Los Angeles. What presidential powers does President Trump have in this situation? Is he allowed to conduct these types of mass deportations? Professor Emily Berman is a constitutional scholar with expertise in executive power and national security law at the University of Houston Law Center. And she joins us now to discuss this situation. Hello, Emily, and welcome to Hello, Houston.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And if you have any questions for Emily about the protest against the ICE raids and the president's deployment of the National Guard, you can call us now at 713-440-8870.
Emily, right. I'd love to start the conversation just by finding out your understanding from where you sit of what is happening in L.A.
Yeah, so there are what I understood to be largely peaceful protests that the LAPD publicly said it had under control. And despite that, and despite no request from Governor Gavin Newsom, who is the commander-in-chief of the California National Guard, the president decided to invoke his authority to nationalize the California Guard and to deploy them to pursue essentially a protective mission to ensure protection of ICE officers, detention facilities, and other aspects of the immigration missions that the federal government is pursuing.
Now, Emily, what type of intel would President Trump be receiving that would be essentially different from what Governor Newsom is saying?
I mean, it's unlikely that there is a whole lot of difference. I suspect that he was hearing through ICE that they were facing mass objections to carrying out ICE's deportation efforts. But again, I think the LAPD's explicitly, and this is no squishy lefty organization, the LAPD said, we've got this under control. There are protests all the time. We're trained to handle this. There's no need to send in guard troops and potentially, as the governor said, inflame the situation and make things actually worse than they already are.
As we'll dig deeper into this conversation, I just want to establish at the start, the president does have the right to do what he did?
The president has the right to, yes, I would, in short, yes, the president does have the authority to do this, but the authority under which he's acting imposes some significant constraints on the role that these guard troops can play. So, not to get too deep in the legal weeds, but there's a statute called the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that the military may not be used for everyday typical law enforcement operations. That means the federal government's troops cannot arrest people, they can't conduct searches and seizures, they can't be involved in detention operations. They can supply logistical support, potentially protections of federal agents or federal facilities. And in fact, there are thousands of National Guard troops at the border and have been for years under both Republican and Democratic presidents, providing those kinds of logistical support operations for the Border Patrol and for ICE. So this is, the authority is the same. But I would say, it's not the president completely overstepping the legal bounds. It is, in fact, a violation of what I would call the norms of the way the president typically has employed federal forces and his authority to deploy National Guard troops.
Well, Gavin Newsom is already saying that he's going to have a lawsuit against the Trump administration. So what is his legal standing, do you think, in this?
Yeah, so the statute that the president has invoked to activate these Guard troops on a federal basis says that the orders given to these troops should be facilitated through the governor's office. And that didn't happen here. Now, this is not something that has ever been litigated, so we don't know, explicitly what that requirement of facilitation actually requires. But it is quite unusual for the federal government to send troops into a state over the objections of the state governor. In fact, it hasn't happened since the 1960s when the president was enforcing the desegregation orders from Brown versus Board of Education. And the state governors were actually actively preventing schools from integrating using their own National Guard troops. So it's only in these very explicit constitutional violation situations where state or local authorities are thwarting the execution of federal law. That's the kind of circumstance in which the federal government has come in and sort of overridden local law enforcement agencies. But here, that's not happened. And so I think Governor Newsom is well within his rights to articulate the ways in which this is a new and troubling use of this kind of authority. And perhaps, depending on how this statute eventually gets interpreted, perhaps procedurally flawed as well.
Well, you mentioned that it might be new and troubling, but was there a breach of state sovereignty? Was there an actual legal breach that happened when the president called in these troops?
Yeah, again, I would say from a sort of layman's understanding, yes. We usually allow states to conduct their own law enforcement operations. The federal government is not permitted to give orders to state and local law enforcement. That is something that is explicitly unconstitutional without the agreement and cooperation of the state governments. Here, again, I think because this is such a novel use of this authority, we haven't heard yet from the courts exactly how this is going to be interpreted. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly stepping on the governor's toes in a way that we don't usually see. And I think, sort of flouting the spirit, if not necessarily the explicit law of the idea of state sovereignty.
We are speaking with Emily Berman, who is with the University of Houston Law Center, talking about presidential powers, the National Guard, executive orders. And we'd love to know what you'd think, or if you have a question for Emily, give us a call, 713-440-8870. I want to go back to a term you used a few minutes ago, which I think is the most troubling in all of this as we try and navigate what's going on both nationally and in often places locally. The concept of, you said, norms. This is the norm. This is the norm. Legally, norms, I guess, mean nothing. It's just a sense of behavior we've done. Are we at the end of a time where we can rely on norms and things all need to be legislated and written into law?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think that lots and lots and lots of norms have been violated.
Well, you say norms violated. Is a norm violated or just not acknowledged? Violated sounds like it is legally binding and they're going against it, where an understanding of the term norms means just everyone tends to do it. So is violated the right word?
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on, you can violate your parents' rules, you can violate moral principles. Those aren't necessarily legally binding, and yet we think of them as something that should constrain behavior. And usually those, whether it's violations or transgressions or however you want to describe it, are enforced not through the official mechanisms of law, but through things like public approbation and objections by the general public, or by, in the first President Trump term, we saw a lot of pushback from within his own administration, right? The Secretary of Defense said, we think it's a really bad idea to deploy federal troops against largely peaceful protests. And so it didn't happen there. And so now that we don't have those sort of, guardrails is the term we often hear employed, we don't have those in place in this second Trump administration, it makes it much easier to simply disregard those norms. Yeah. And it's up to the American people to decide if they're going to stand for it.
Now, we're using the word violation, however, when we're looking at this law, but is it more of an interpretation that President Trump is interpreting the law to make it essentially work for him? And it's almost, in a way, not so much a violation, but when we look at the Posse Comitatus Act that was enacted in 1878, we also saw him, enact other immigration procedures in the Alien Act. Could it simply be that our president is interpreting the Constitution and the laws and the policy around this in a way that is completely legal, but just being interpreted in a different way, not necessarily violating anything?
Yeah, I think he's certainly interpreting it in new and different ways and adopting extraordinarily broad conceptions of ideas like, for example, this particular statute authorized the president to federalize the National Guard when there's a, quote, rebellion against the authority of the U.S. government. So we see the word rebellion used in a new and different way, the same way that we've heard them use in the Alien Enemies Act cases the word invasion. We're being invaded by immigrants. And so it is sort of the president taking words that have particular meaning to particular people and sort of imposing his own views on what those words mean. The courts in some instances have pushed back on that. We've seen lots of district courts say, you cannot use the Alien Enemies Act here because this is not an invasion, because an invasion requires a government of a country to send military troops across the border. That's not happening here. So whether that will ultimately be the interpretation of that act once it gets up to the Supreme Court, we don't know. But there was, I have to say that during the Biden administration, particularly at the beginning of the Biden administration, there were a lot of legal scholars and commentators saying there are a lot of laws out there that give the president emergency authority, that don't define what an emergency is, that don't specify whether the courts have the power to disagree with the president if the president has declared there to be an emergency. And so people sort of advocated, let's clarify some of these laws and put some constraints on presidential discretion in these quote unquote emergency situations. And that didn't happen. And I think we're seeing the results of that. You can also point to the tariffs that President Trump imposed under the Emergency Economic Powers Act. Those were meant to be, that's a power that he has claimed because there is a quote unquote emergency arising out of trade deficit. I don't think that meets the definition that anyone would give of the kind of emergency that statute was first enacted to address. And time will tell whether the courts will be willing to second guess the president's definition of these words. Historically, especially in sort of these national security contexts, the courts have been quite deferential to the president and his decisions about what's necessary for the national security.
We are
Whether
speaking. I'm
this
going to jump in
president-
here. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Finish your thought.
I was just going to say whether this president is going to continue to be afforded that deference is yet to be seen.
I just want to remind everyone we're talking to constitutional scholar Emily Berman from the University of Houston Law Center. If you have questions for Emily, give us a call, 713-440-8870. Danielle is on the line from Deer Park. Danielle, what's your question?
Hi, thank you for taking my call. What I wanted to say was, when you look at the videos that are coming out of LA, overwhelmingly, if not all, of the aggression is coming from the side of the people who are presenting themselves as ICE agents or FBI agents. They've used flashbangs, tear gas, other types of ammunition. There's a video of the Australian reporter who was shot in the back as her back was turned, So I'd really like to know what basis Trump feels he has to imply that there is an insurrection or riot, because that is not what has been presented to the public and has been seen. When the January 6th rioters broke in and actually murdered people and intended to kill people in the government, he was supporting that. So as long as it worked for him, he didn't have a problem with it. But when he feels that it goes against what he wants to do, he thinks that he has carte blanche to just interpret laws to allow him to do whatever type of aggression he has. And the American people have the right to the free assembly.
Yeah. Danielle, thank you for that. Emily, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. We can really get bogged down in the weeds of what's an emergency and what's a rebellion, but the fact is that this president is sending federal troops to oversee or surveil or potentially interfere with First Amendment protected protest activity by the American people. And that is simply a significant red flag in any democracy. I think the point about, which side the violence is coming from, there's some concern among commentators. It could be that this is meant to simply be a provocative action, that the president is trying to provoke violence so that he can, crack down on it or, declare that the Insurrection Act is in force and use the federal government troops even more decisively.
Yeah.
So,
I don't think it's
keeping that point in mind is important.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that he deployed the National Guard with a Democratic governor in place. I don't think that. I don't. If it was Governor Abbott, I don't think he would have done it. I don't think he will do it in a red state.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think he knows that with respect. I mean, I'm no political analyst, but with respect to his supporters, picking these kind of fights is good for him.
Right.
And he had a pretty bad week last week. And so this is quite a convenient change of subject for him, I think.
And we did get a comment on our YouTube comments from Dark One, says an interpretation can be a violation. Just because you interpret a law one way does not mean the government, the courts, agree. And we have seen that. The courts have stopped multiple policies and things that President Trump has tried to move forward, and they've said, wait a minute, hold on, you can't do that. What do you think will happen next, given past situations like this, Emily? What is next most likely to happen in this situation?
Well, far be it from me to predict. But what I hope is that this incident has driven home to Americans how important it is to maintain the peacefulness of their protests, to not give the government any excuse for this kind of deployment. And so hopefully things will calm down in LA, and that will be the end of it. But I worry that with all the immigration enforcement going on across the country, with the protests that are coming up on January 14th, the No King's Day protests, that I fear that we might see more of this in other places around the country
to your point,
weeks.
we're getting a text saying Mexican flags, Palestinian flags. This is not troops versus U.S. citizens. It's troops versus an invasion. I'm not sure I agree with that, but to your point about Americans understanding that we need to protest peacefully and keep it that way, making up protests more inflammatory with certain flags or posters or, I guess, whatever you want to use, is probably not the better way to go these days.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say that because people should be free to exercise their First Amendment rights and to engage in peaceful expression of any kind. But given the realities, and given that the White House has characterized these protests as violent mobs, I think it's important that the video tells the story that that's not what's going on.
And it's interesting that this person that texted us about Mexican flags, Palestinian flags, this is not troops versus U.S. citizens. These people could be U.S. citizens waving a Mexican flag or waving a Palestinian flag.
They were there to support their neighbors.
To show, we have to be very careful when we're looking at things not to make assumptions.
Absolutely. And there are plenty of American citizens that are from Palestine or from Mexico. They could be both citizens and supporting their country of origin.
Professor Emily Berman is a constitutional scholar with expertise in executive power and national security law at the University of Houston Law Center. Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.